I love a good crime stat, but they don't always tell you everything. And you may have seen me, if you follow me on Twitter, posting all of my different crime stats for all of the different ethnicities under the sun, because they're really useful in understanding the nature of the world. Here we have, this is just an example, but it's Britain breaking down the arrest rate for every 1,000 people by ethnicity. You can notice, here's white at 9.4. You can see the usual suspects, black obviously twice as represented, black others 5 times overrepresented, gypsies obviously overrepresented.
But most crimes are done by white men.
Yes, statistically that is true, but there is such a wonderful thing, this wonderful white invention known as per capita.
No, I don't understand that. I don't know those words. I refuse to understand that concept. It's just white men do most of the crime. That's the end of the story. Don't look into it any further than that. No,
very convincing.
Per capita, yeah. What a mad thing, and that's reality, right? That's just the reality.
Yeah. I'm not saying necessarily that you should blame every single person in that group for the actions of these people.
But just have eyes in the back of your head, because they're much more likely to do something criminal and violent.
Potentially, yes. But also, you need to have an informed view to be able to solve the problem, right? If you want to get rid of crime, it's useful to know who's committing the crimes. So one thing I wanted to draw attention to is India and Pakistan. Pakistanis in Britain are more likely than the native white majority to commit crime, but the Indians are actually half as likely. And I think this plays out with anecdotal experience, because I've lived alongside lots of Indians now, living in Swindon for almost 5 years, and they're not really violent people. They don't really cause lots of social problems. At worst, perhaps they might be a little bit ignorant of doorway etiquette and
yeah, exactly,
and sort of British manners, and around a lot of the Indian food shops there is a lot of litter and waste on the floor. So they're a bit messy, and sometimes they can be a bit rude, but in the grand scheme of things that are ailing Britain, they're not really the ones causing problems. They sometimes can, but usually, from what I've seen in Swindon at least, they're just families that are living a relatively normal life, and they're suffering the same sorts of things that actually the natives are. I've not gone soft all of a sudden and said, you know what, they're all welcome here. I'm not necessarily saying that, but I'm just saying, acknowledging the nature of the problem. But that statistic doesn't tell you everything, of course, because...
say real quick, just to build on what you said there. I live in a building which is mostly Indians. Mm-hmm. And they must be Indians because they all sort of celebrate Diwali and not...
It's a bit of a giveaway.
And not Eid. And they're just Indians, not Pakistanis or Bangladeshis. Mm-hmm. And there's no sense of threat in the air whatsoever. Never ever been intimidated, never had any sort of altercation, nothing. They keep themselves to themselves, and the only real problem, you might say, is that they're a bit impolite. A little bit impolite, not even that badly impolite, but just never
British standards, which most of the world fails on. Let's be honest.
Never hold a door open for you ever, and if you do it for them, they just walk through without saying thank you, and little things like that. Whereas I have lived in and around more Muslim populations, and it's not the same. It's really not the same.
Yeah. So I'm going to go over some of the actual crime statistics for India itself, because we can get to, because of course, much below average, appreciate that, obviously. It's not the same as black over there doing a very significant portion of these crimes. So violent crimes like murder and assault are reported less frequently per capita than in places like the US or Brazil. Of course, with these sorts of things, it could also be how they're measured and reported, because, for example, Japan tends to have far fewer crimes reported, but also the threshold to have something registered as a reported crime is much higher than elsewhere.
Sorry, are you talking about in India now?
Yes.
Okay, just to be clear for everyone in there. Mm-hmm. You're now talking about crime in India?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's 3 per 100,000 people, and for South Africa it's 36, for the USA it's 7, okay. And for the UK it's 1.1. But we still, to this day, even with mass migration, have one of the lowest crime rates in the world. It's because the native British, we just don't do crime, really, or very rarely.
Sometimes you get a Raoul Moat or a Hungerford or a Dr. Shipman or...
I think our worst
something,
excesses is like binge drinking and getting into a scrap outside of a pub, but then people shake hands and get over it if the police don't turn up.
Yeah.
And everything's fine. It's very rare that things sort of go in excess of that.
We get the odd sort of Fred West, right?
Yes, we do have the odd serial.
But yeah, just like big chunks of our population just killing each other on the streets for over nothing. You know, we don't do that. We haven't done that for a long... You know, it's where individual murders are still shocking to us.
Yeah,
right?
they still very much are. It's not something that people have got used to even yet, even after all of this diversifying. But to get back to the Indian crime stats, property crimes like burglary or theft are also relatively lower per capita.
In India. Right.
However, sexual violence is a significant issue, and it's likely underreported as well, just by the nature of Indian society. And also, it's worth mentioning, although I'm not going into focus on this aspect, fraud, bribery, and scams, need I say the latter one, I think we all know about that, are also a significant issue. And apparently, the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, so that's just measuring people's perception of their own country, as far as I'm aware, at least, India is ranked 93rd out of 190. So it's in the just edging into the lower half of the world for fraud, bribery, and scams. Because, of course, the Indian scammer is sort of idiosyncratic now. I mean, if you were to ask Zoomers today in Britain, what's the currency of India, half of them might say gift cards rather than rupees. But
Yeah.
it's also worth noting, for the sake of being fair, India is huge. It's got 1.4 billion people. There's a large amount of variation between those peoples. It's an entire subcontinent. One of the main divisions is urban versus rural. Lots more crime in the urban areas. And all of the issues we're going to discuss have very vocal critics in India. So it's not like they're just accepting of this. There are loads and loads of groups that are campaigning against all of the fraud and bribery and stuff and the scams, as well as the sexual violence, which I think in particular, when there's a case of that going on, is a massive political issue. And so it's not that the people themselves are blind to these things, but with such a large population, you're going to have some bad apples. It's true of any population, right? And as even Reuters can acknowledge, India struggles with high, I can't say that word on YouTube, sexual assault cases, low conviction rates. So basically, they're just struggling to actually deal with the problem in India. And there was a video that went quite viral of a woman in a club in London, and for some reason it's not loading, but if you were able to see it, which I think is probably a mercy you can't, he's basically touching her up and trying to grab her when she's clearly not into it. Very obvious. And a British man might immediately pick up on the fact she's not interested, but clearly he had no idea. And it is suggesting that there's a cultural difference here. And this is the Indian diaspora here. If you could zoom out a little bit, Samson, or anyone. Thank you. This is a bit of an unfortunate colour scheme, because the more brown it is, the higher density of Indians outside of India. Obviously, India, there's lots of Indians in India, so you don't really need that part of it. But you can see that Pakistan and Bangladesh and the surrounding areas, is that Saudi Arabia, Britain, Canada, America, South Africa. These are all countries that we actually know of. Like in 2021, there was an anti-Indian riot in South Africa, in part at least. They were angry at the Gupta brothers for basically a bribery scandal, and then targeted loads of Indians.
I know the India-South Africa connection is long and storied.
Well, that's our sort of empire,
right,
responsible for that, isn't it?
Right. I mean, yes, part of
but,
it. Yeah.
They're very widespread around the world, and I think there are lots of questions about, well, out of this 1.4 billion population, are there being, is there enough vetting against this problem? Because if you look at some of the cases that have gone on in India, it's horrifying. And just to let everyone know, In the 2021 census in Britain suggested that 1.86 million people from India are here legally, which is 3.1% of the total population. In America, it's estimated that it's 5.4 million. In Canada, it's 1.8 million, or 5.1% of the population. So that's sizable enough that it's possible that some of the worst excesses of the problems they're facing in India may be brought to the West. And I'm going to look at some of these cases. And by the way, if you've got children in the room, it's probably a good idea to turn this off now. And if you're eating your dinner, perhaps a good idea to come back to this later, because this is not for someone with a strong stomach. But I think it's important to look at the horrors of the world in the face and address them accordingly, because this next story is really quite horrible. Oh yes, of course, there's just India is the country with the most diaspora as well. I forgot to mention that. Mexico's next, Russia's next, then China, Syria. You can sort of expect these, can't you? And obviously Mexico's just in the United States. So I think the problem's only going to get worse, if there is a problem at all. So here we are. I'm going to read this, and this is very horrifying. So a teenager was brutally gang sexually assaulted, I've got to change the word for YouTube, by 23 men during a hellish week ordeal during which her attackers drugged her with tainted noodles, police in India have revealed. The 19-year-old alleged that she was kidnapped by a man while returning from a friend's house on the 29th of March in Varanasi, northern India. She said she was taken to her attacker's cafe in Lanka, a nearby town 3 miles southeast of Varanasi, and sexually assaulted. The teen was then taken by another man and his friend to a highway where she was sexually assaulted before she was dropped off in Nadesar, another town. There, the vulnerable victim was taken to a second cafe, this time in another place, by 5 men who allegedly drugged her and then gang sexually assaulted her. She was then later taken to a hotel and forced to massage a stranger before she was sexually assaulted again. And then she tried leaving the hotel, and then she was kidnapped by another man and taken to a hotel where he sexually assaulted her and abandoned her. She was then taken to a warehouse nearly 2 hours outside of her home city, where she was sexually assaulted by another 3 men. And then she managed to escape to a nearby shopping mall near her home, and then she was offered noodles by 2 strangers, but the men had drugged the food, and then she was taken away to be attacked before being left in a place near the Ganges River. She was then taken to another hotel where she was sexually assaulted by 5 men before finally managing to make it home to her family on the 4th of April, who filed a police report, and then 6 people have been arrested and charged. And they've continued to raid locations trying to find all of these people. But what we've seen here is that there were a series of men who saw a vulnerable young girl who was in distress and did all of that. So you've either got to be the most unlucky person in the world to stumble across all of these people, or there's a massive underlying problem here. And I think it's that latter one, isn't it?
Yeah, of course it is, yeah.
It's that it seems to be the default thing in parts of India that if they see a young girl who's unattended, that they sexually assault her as a matter of course and get their friends in on it. And this is something that no one's taking seriously. You know, even in the United States, members of the Trump administration are saying we need more people from India. You know, Vivek Ramaswamy mysteriously talks about the virtues of how hardworking Indians are whilst Americans are lazy. Can't think of why he said that. And of course, Trump doing the U-turn on the H-1B visas, which is mainly for the tech sector and mainly for people from India who couldn't otherwise go through the legal means. And you've got to be asking the question, well, if this is what happens in India, who knows who you're getting? There's not being nearly enough checks to find these sorts of people. And how do you even check for it? Like, you can't just, you know, at the border say, are you into sexual assault? And they're like, oh, sorry, I'm not actually. That's not going to work, is it? You can't necessarily know. And I'm of the opinion that you can't really give people the benefit of the doubt when the safety of your own citizenry is at risk. And you wouldn't necessarily even get this impression from looking at the crime stats, of course, because if you look at Britons, for example, they're half as likely to commit crime, but the nature of the crime when it is committed, as you can see here, is far, far more severe than you might otherwise guess from the crime statistics. And so the statistics are useful insofar as they can give you an approximation, but the detail's really important here. And there are lots of other examples of this.
I was just going to say, I think is there not an example of something similar, not as bad as that, but something similar happening in Britain? Was it somewhere in Wolverhampton or something where a woman was raped, or kidnapped, raped, and then when she got away or they let her go, she was just immediately picked up by a completely different set of rapists and raped again?
It sounds about right. Also,
During her escape.
You can't drop an R-bomb on YouTube, otherwise it gets funny. We'll be fine. I think they allow at least 2.
Okay. Well, the guys.
So we're up to our R-bomb limit.
Guys can bleep it out.
No, it'll be fine. It'll be fine.
So yeah, is there also? I don't know if you might go into it, but isn't there the thing about that on trains? That trains are very, very, very unsafe in India for women. Is that
and for the people riding on the top as well? Yeah.
Sexually assaulted on a train because you sort of can't get away, apart from anything else. And don't they want to segregate trains to try and...
They're talking about that in Japan as well, and lots of places. Yeah,
I think here
it's a silly idea because it's what you're doing is creating a buffet cart for a potential assaulter, right?
And just refusing to deal with the actual issue.
Yeah, well, it's
core issue.
British people are not doing crimes like this, are they? Here's another one here where a man was arrested after a German woman was basically on holiday, and apparently the guy offered to give her a lift and was in his car with a bunch of minors, and then he basically just dropped them off and drove her to a remote location to try and assault her. I think presumably she managed to get away, but it's still a sort of worrying thing of, you could expect to be getting a lift from like a taxi or something, and then they'll just drive you off and do whatever. And they did actually, I think, find the guy, or at least the vehicle.
There's a clip on Twitter, you might have seen it, because I think it had millions and millions of views, where it's some woman in America, and she's getting an Uber or just a taxi of some type, and it's an Indian or Pakistani driver, and she's talking to him on her phone, and he just openly says, if we was in India, I would...
I've seen that, yeah.
You've probably seen it because it's got millions and millions and millions of views. And he's just laughing and joking with her, saying, yeah, if this was in India, I would drive you somewhere remote and sexually assault you. And she's like, really? Really? And he's like, yeah. And she's like, okay. Like, it suddenly takes a really dark turn. But he just openly admits, just completely says it.
Shameless, yeah.
Yeah, completely shameless, yeah.
But
I know that's only an anecdotal piece of evidence.
These 2 examples, by the way, are just news that's come out in the past few days. Here's another one from April as well. This was a sexual assault and murder of a young girl. Apparently she was on the way to her relative's place in the same neighbourhood, and she got picked up and found that same evening having been murdered. This is just another example of something that's happened on a similar day. This is from the 15th of February. A man, because India doesn't have laws against marital sexual assault, a man did that to his wife, who then died a few hours later, and he was released.
Mate,
I know, it's horrible, isn't it? And you can see the sort of campaigns that are going on in India against this, because that's barbaric. There's the only word for it, amongst host of other stronger ones, perhaps. Then going back to March, an Israeli tourist and an American tourist got targeted by a group of men. They were out stargazing, and apparently the men were pushed into a river, and one of the Indian men, because there were some natives, one was an Israeli woman and an Indian woman and an American man and 2 Indian men as a group, and they were stargazing, minding their own business. And a group of men basically comes out of the darkness, pushes the men into the river. One of them drowns, 2 of them swim to safety, and then sexually assaulted the women. And this actually This happened at a popular tourist destination in southern India, and hundreds of the tourists just upped and left. It was a UNESCO heritage site. You can see it there. Loads of tourists just left because they realised, okay, this place isn't safe for us anymore. Which, to be honest, if you're a woman, I wouldn't go to India. Your own safety. It's not safe there. And then there's this one. This was from March again. So this is only, less than a month ago still. There are lots of instances. She went to meet an Indian man she met online for dinner. He turned up with his friend. And then after they finished dinner, they went to a hotel and sexually assaulted her. Which is a bit strange. She was meant to be meeting just the person she'd been speaking to, and he just turns up with his mate for some reason. Seems like they're very close with their friends, a lot of these people, aren't they? They've always got a mate in tow. I don't understand that. There's the case of this guy who styled himself as a Christian preacher. He was apparently had millions of followers and all that sort of stuff. He sexually assaulted a woman, filmed it, and tried to use it to blackmail her, which actually seems to happen a lot more in India than you think. I've read a few instances of that. And
where it's not just a little bit embarrassing or very embarrassing. It's not just embarrassing. It actually can affect all your family and your status in society. It's much more serious, right?
Yeah, of course.
In their world.
Mm-hmm. And this is just horrifying, right? Indian teenager alleges sexual assault over 5 years by nearly 60 schoolmates, neighbours and relatives and strangers. If this doesn't go to highlight the nature of the problem, I don't know what does. So I'm going to read this. I'm sorry, it's really grim. 5 years ago, a 13-year-old girl, the daughter of a poor-wage labourer from one of India's most marginalised communities, was allegedly sexually abused by one of her neighbours in the village where she lived. Her alleged abuser filmed it, and the police are investigating whether he used the images to blackmail and manipulate the girl into being sexually assaulted by dozens of other men and boys over the next 5 years. Police say the allegations only came to light after the girl, now 18, spoke to a counsellor visiting her college in Kerala State and detailed the years of horrific abuse. A total of 58 men and boys have been arrested and accused of the sexual assault. Another 2 men wanted in connection with the case have fled the country. Wonder where they fled to. Just throwing that one out there. Among the accused are her schoolmates, her relatives, her neighbours, men from all corners of her life, ranging from minors to men in their mid-40s, according to the case documents reviewed by CNN and interviews with local police. Charges have not yet been filed, and the 58 men remain in detention. None of the accused has spoken publicly about the allegations, and the girl has not been identified under the law. So, obviously we don't know for absolute certain whether this story is true, but it sounds very familiar to that previous one that we talked about of right at the start of the 23 different men targeting that girl, where just every man in her life basically targeted her and sexually assaulted her. And if that is what happens in parts of India, it'd be important to have a proper understanding of it. If this is the main ethnic group that we're getting our immigrants from, in Britain at least, Indians are the main minority. And the same goes for Canada, I imagine, and it's increasing in the United States. And this is important. You wouldn't get it from the crime data, but all of these anecdotal examples paint a very horrific picture, don't they? It's like some of the worst cases of this sort of thing I've ever read, and it was a difficult thing to put all this together. I've got one more link here. A police volunteer even got a life sentence, and he then went on to murder a junior doctor after doing so as well. So you can't even necessarily trust the police. So it speaks of a society that is entirely corrupted by this sort of thing, that every man a young girl comes into contact with will take advantage, which in Britain is unthinkable. You know, I can think of instances in my own life where there have been young kids like lost in a supermarket, and the default thing to do is you take them over to a figure of authority who speaks on the tannoy, and you wait with them until their parents turn up. That's the default. No one would deviate from that.
I've both had that happen to me when I was a kid, and then been the adult in that situation
Same here.
as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I've literally been walking around a really massive Tesco's, and there's some little toddler, apparently unescorted, and you just go get someone.
And that's the proper thing to do.
Because obviously, you don't just leave. Yeah. Oh, God.
And, of course, that cultural practice that we have entrenched in us by merit of being Englishmen is not entrenched in people from India, obviously. We weren't there for long enough to enculturate that into them. And by bringing them here, we're bringing these sorts of same problems. And it's to the point where, in fact, the monkeys in India actually have a greater moral compass than many of the men. And this is a story, of course, if you're listening. Monkey saved 6-year-old girl from sexual assault attempt in Uttar Pradesh. The monkey started attacking the man. If that's not a condemnation of a certain section of your population, I don't know what is. I feel very sorry for Indian women now, to be honest, after reading all that. And yes, that's something that you wouldn't have been able to get from the data, but it is very important and very worth knowing about. If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.